And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Pat Flynn of Philosophy for the People on YouTube. Check it out, folks. It's a great channel. Subscribe. Tell your friends about it, especially anybody that's interested in clear thinking and philosophy. You'll love the channel. We're talking about objections to the existence of God. And, kind of picking up where we left off before the break. One of the things I like about the contingency argument is it seems like you don't have to do as much laying out the groundwork for the argument in regards to, say, an accidental causal chain versus, essential causal chain, like you would with the argument from motion, right. Where contingency, it's like it's kind of baked in. So you know that it's essential connection between all the points.
Yeah, these are important differences. Now, of course, I think it's, you can make those I guess more metaphysically rigorous moves for people who aren't familiar. An essentially ordered causal series is where in my production of something, I'm borrowing the power to produce that something from something else, right? So there's sort of this notion of derivativeness inherent to an essentially ordered causal series. An example that Aquinas gives is the hand pushing the stick, moving the stone, right? Where the stone is only sort of receiving the power, where the stick is only receiving the power to move the stone because of the hand, right? That would be a sort of a stock example of an essentially ordered causal series. An accidentally ordered causal series is where I don't have to really borrow the power from anything else to produce something. And the stock example there is, father begetting a son, right? He doesn't need to borrow the power actively right now from his grandfather to do that, right? So Aquinas is, of course, going to argue that when it comes to the sort of causal structure, the very existence of things, right, it's going to fall into that category of an essentially ordered causal series. And the reason that's important for Aquinas and other later Thomists is those series are necessarily terminating. They're not going to be explanatory unless they're terminating in some primary or fundamental member that has a sort of productive power in virtue of what it is, rather than deriving it from something else, right? So, if a paintbrush is, here's another kind of example that I've heard used, I kind of like it, is used as an explanation for how the fence is being painted. It doesn't matter how long the handle of the paintbrush is, right? You extend it out infinitely, right? It's never going to be an adequate explanation, right? Unless you connect it to something else like a machine or a human that actually does have the power to kind of to move it, right? But I think you're right. I don't think the other versions of the contingency argument necessarily require making those causal distinctions. I think they're helpful causal distinctions to make. I think they're ultimately right. But it's sometimes nice to have some tools in the kit where if you don't have to do a bunch of, in the weeds metaphysics at Buffalo Wild Wings, all the better, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, if it's going to be in depth, it'd probably be like Buddy's Pizza with style pizza, because you're going to be there a while.
Be there a while, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I also like my pizza as thick as my metaphysics, and Buddy's is a place to go for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you didn't eat for like a week afterwards.
No, but it was amazing pizza. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I really like about the contingency argument, it's neat in that sense. So you could put all the emphasis, I think, where the engine works in those arguments, where with other arguments like from motion, you kind of have to lay down a metaphysic and then start getting to the engine room where, okay, what exactly is motion? What is change? And then move from there.
Which is why they're so often misunderstood. Yeah, there really is so much, I want to say, upfront or background metaphysical work that has to be done to at least even understand Aquinas's arguments, give them a charitable interpretation, right? And that's just not something that's done frequently, even among professional philosophers, let alone the average YouTuber who feels compelled to comment on his arguments or something like that, right? The contingency argument is very simple, just to kind of clarify. Really, it's kind of it's saying this, look, there's certain things that are not inherently self-explanatory. Right? Their intelligibility is restricted just looking at those things in and of themselves. They're always pointing beyond, and especially fundamentally concerning their very existence. There's just a lot of things or categories that do not seem to be self-explanatory concerning their existence. And we can go through the different categories: composite things, changing things, qualitatively finite things. Really, and the modern contingency argument just focuses on contingent things. And we didn't even really talk about what we meant by contingent things, but we just mean things that could have been otherwise, right?
Yeah, right.
There's nothing about their nature that demands that they be included in reality, right? Again, maybe something apart from them has demanded that they be in reality, but nothing about their nature that demands they be in reality, right? So types of causal series are not really entirely relevant to that. If you have an explanatory principle that just sort of ranges over all contingent things, plural, so you don't think they have to stack up into one gigantic thing. You can just say all the contingent things together, whatever they are, right? We need an explanation of that. And clearly, to avoid inadequacy or circularity, you're going to have to make a category shift, right? And away from the contingent to the necessary. And I think that just has a lot of intuitive force. And well, I know it does, because like when I present it to people who haven't really thought about these things before, like they tend to acknowledge like, oh yeah, that seems highly plausible and intuitive. Now again, there's complicated objections you got to make your way through, and we're trying to do that here. But I think if people are being honest and fair, that you have to admit there's just a lot of intuitive force to the basic line of that sort of reasoning. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a wide range of applicability too, like you said. Qualitative, it could be metaphysical, it could be any kind of composite being. It's going to be contingent, and so I mean, you could use any stock example, and it works nice.
Yeah. Now, to bring in like a very common objection, I don't think this is a very serious one, but it's very common, is, well, who caused God? Objection, right? This is sometimes thrown at it, right? But if people have been paying attention carefully to this conversation, or have read carefully anybody who advances the contingency argument, at least anybody of significant repute, they never ever start with a claim that everything has or needs a cause, right? They might say that everything has an explanation, but not all explanations are causal explanations. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, right? I can explain why there's no square circles because those are contradictory structures and contradictions are impossible. It's not a causal explanation, but it's still a satisfactory explanation, right? Mm-hmm. God, traditionally understood, is not a being that just caused himself to exist. God is a being that has a sort of necessary nature such that God is robustly metaphysically necessary because his essence just is to exist. Existence exists and existence is God. And God has to sort of be understood in a certain way if he's going to be the type of being that could possibly be self-explanatory, right? Such that if we could grasp the essence of God, it would be clear to us. God's necessary existence would be clear to us, right? Now, of course, most philosophers, including especially Aquinas, say that's not something we can do. We can infer that God exists and has the nature of this sort, but we can't directly grasp it. So, if composite things are not necessarily existing beings, right, then God can't be composite, right? That's why classical theists maintain that God is absolutely simple. If contingent beings are not, that sort of buck stops here, metaphysical arrival point, then God has to be necessary, non-contingent, right? If changing things always point beyond themselves to a cause, God can't be changing, right? And so on down the list. And that's exactly what theists have said down the line. So it's not arbitrary or ad hoc to say that God doesn't have a cause, because we've never started with the premise in hand that everything has a cause, even if we say that everything has an explanation, because we do think God has an explanation. It's just an internal explanation, not an extrinsic explanation. And that's a really common objection. I mean, it's nonstop, especially online, but it's a really, really bad objection that just often totally misunderstands what the natural theologians were up to in trying to argue for the existence of God. Mm-hmm.
Right. So would this be a difficulty for someone who would deny simplicity, like William Lane Craig?
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think as you were saying, like how he would respond to that. That'd be pretty hard to avoid, like falling into that trap.
Yeah, well, we think about it like this, right? We want a worldview that's going to bring brute facts down to zero, if we're thinking in a Leibnizian sense, because we think that PSR is true. We kind of need it for reason. PSR is incompatible with brute facts. So I want to make sure whatever my ultimate explanation is, it's the sort of thing where I'm not going to have to admit brute facts. It's not even relevant that it might have fewer brute facts. Like, we want none. None whatsoever, right? And I think that the traditional metaphysicians like Aquinas like clearly understood this, even though they weren't thinking about it in exactly the same way, that if you're going to get an ultimate explanation for everything, if you're going to be able to affirm reality as completely intrinsically intelligible, that fundamental feature of reality is going to have to exist in a particular way, right? It's going to have to escape all those categories that otherwise demand some extrinsic source of intelligibility. And compositeness is a huge one. And I mean, for Aquinas, it's like the biggest one, right? And it's not enough, as thinkers like Dr. Craig do, just to like call something necessary, because atheists do that too. Atheists will sometimes respond to the contingency argument and be like, well, maybe there's just a portion of physical reality that's necessary. And that's lame when the atheist does it, because we know there's nothing relevantly different about any physical reality that could confer this property of necessary existence. So it's lame when the atheist does it and ad hoc, but I also think it's lame when certain theists do it, right?
Yeah, right.
Like, if your God is complex, he hasn't escaped the relevant categories of things that demand an extrinsic explanation. So in a sense, you're not really better off in an in principle way than the atheist. And this is why a lot of classical theists, and I'm in this camp, are sometimes polemical about it, to say that to deny classical theism and simplicity just is to admit atheism. And what we mean by that is not that like Dr. Craig is an atheist, but he has now sort of put himself in a position where the atheist could legitimately object to him having brute facts too, and say, look, we're not really any worse off than you. And maybe you get into like this brute facts arm race. Well, at least I have freer than you do. But to me, that's irrelevant. Once you open up Pandora's box of brute facts, it's just absurdity, no matter whether you have 1 or 10 million of them. So yeah, no, I think that is a big problem for these alternative theistic perspectives. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Well, hey, what's coming up next on Philosophy for the People?
Yeah, lots of good stuff. Well, I just had some recent good conversations, one with Dr. Tyler McNabb on God and political authority, and that was interesting because he argues that political authority is a real thing, and the best explanation for that is a theistic one. So he actually uses political authority to make a probabilistic argument for the existence of God, not a metaphysical demonstration. But he also says that theism is, you can run the other way too. If you're a theist and you have a good way to make sense of political authority. So that's the most recent one. I've got some conversations coming up next month, but people can subscribe and be surprised to what it's on.
Hey, there you go. All right. Well, Pat, thank you so much for coming on the show. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Gary. Always a joy.